Okay, hello everyone. This is Alan Elsner. I'm the Vice President of Communications for J Street, and we're here in the J Street office in Washington, D.C. to discuss the new Palestinian interim unity government that was announced on Monday by President Abbas. And I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, and we're very fortunate to have as our guest and resident expert Leila Hilal, who is Director of the Middle East Task Force at New America Foundation. Leila focuses on Syria, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and issues related to U.S. foreign policy, community-based change, constitution-making, and transitional justice in the broader Middle East and North Africa. Prior to joining New America, Leila served as Senior Policy Advisor to the Commissioner General of the Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, and as Legal Advisor to the Palestinian negotiators from 2002 to 2008. She has led numerous research missions on human rights and post-conflict scenario building and transitional justice in the Middle East, including for Chatham House, the International Center for Transitional Justice, and the Euromed Human Rights Network for Human Rights. Thank you very much for joining us, Leila, and I'm just going to hand it over to you to make whichever remarks to set the context for our discussion.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me and for convening this discussion on the new government. I think it's a very important topic, and since it was announced, there's been a lot of noise on the airways, and so it's very useful to step back and try to look at what's happening and assess opportunities and challenges. So again, thank you. My opening remarks, I think I will respond to the first question that you had suggested I try to answer, which is, will this agreement and the new government have any kind of real impact on the ground? And I think that we have to keep in mind that that it's a very fragile situation of unity, if you want to call it that. I think that may be a stretch. The term that's been used is consensus. It's more of a consensus-based government that was agreed, and it's fragile. We have seen in the past few days positive signals in the ability of Hamas and the Fatah to agree to a government. And I don't know if you or the viewers have seen the bios of the ministers, but they are indeed all independent technocrats with very impressive backgrounds. And I think that it is something positive. It's positive for, at a political level, for the Palestinians who wanted to see unity. And it's positive in the sense that perhaps this government could make a difference in terms of the decisions it makes and the actions it takes as a government. And so, given the fragility of the situation, if this new government, interim government, has a chance to succeed, I think there is an opportunity to perhaps put Gaza back on the table. There's a very the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is serious. Some 70 to 80% of the people rely on international assistance for just basic survival, but a situation of blockading 1.7 million people is a human rights situation that shouldn't be allowed to continue. And so we have now a chance to put Gaza back on the table, to remind ourselves that we have to resolve and address the rights and needs of people in Gaza, as well as to try to address the atrophy of the Gaza institutions that has occurred since the breakup of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. While West Bank PA institutions have been allowed to progress and evolve and receive international funding, Gaza institutions have crawled along ad hoc, and this has had an impact on the humanitarian crisis. It's not the primary problem, but it's part of the problem. So we could see a reinvigoration of Palestinian institutions in Gaza. We could see perhaps more pressure on Israel to try to ease the blockade, to change the status quo around Gaza, which would be good for everyone, I think. I think there's a peace or non-violent dividend that Israel could see if this is successful. Because there would be no incentive for Hamas to engage in violence, and other groups that have shot rockets, etc., would be similarly dissuaded from engaging in that kind of activity if we could see an improvement of the situation on the ground. And so I think that those are some of the best case on the ground benefits that we could see. Now, of course, the military occupation is the primary determinant of the Palestinian condition, and this agreement seems to have provoked the Israeli government more than appease it. So, of course, we have to be measured in our expectations of what can change. But the fact is that if it's allowed to succeed and move forward, we could see some changes. And that's just regarding the humanitarian situation. There's a lot to say as well on the political side of things with respect to the Palestinian political scene.
Which we will get to.
Yes.
So one of the key parts of this agreement is it's an interim agreement which is supposed to pave the way to elections in 6 months.
Right.
So I guess the question is, will there be elections, do you think, in the West Bank, and even more critically in Gaza, where Fatah was basically kicked out, expelled, and political activity has been very limited? Would there be what we would regard as free and fair elections?
Well, the agreement is to hold elections for president, the PA, the PNC, which is the quasi-legislative body of the PLO, and the Palestinian Legislative Council, within 6 months of the agreement. And I think that this is the real benchmark of success in terms of Palestinian unity, and it's the one point that I think will present the greatest set of challenges. There has been agreement between Hamas and Fatah before to hold elections, and those previous agreements have always fallen through. Hamas and Fatah will have to agree on the terms of the election. There is an election law in place, which is based on proportional representation, which is generally considered to provide a better chance for equal participation between a variety of actors, not just the main political parties. And there are several presidential decrees in place. And so Hamas and Fatah will have to review these laws and regulations and decisions that govern elections and come to some agreement on how elections will proceed. That will be a challenge. There will be a challenge in actually getting Israel to agree to let the elections be held. And already Netanyahu has said that they will block elections. And if Palestinians don't have the freedom of movement, if they're not able to hold elections in East Jerusalem, then there will be less interest in holding elections generally, but also then each side can use this as a card to say, we can't move forward to do the hard stuff. So I think there's a real question mark as to whether there will be elections. But of course, that is what is really what should happen in order to see the political dividend of this agreement with respect to Palestinians.
Leila, stepping back one step, why do you think this agreement, the sides were able to reach this agreement now when they were not able to reach this agreement previously?
Well, we've seen the analysis that Hamas has been weakened by the changes in the region with respect to the authoritarian renewal in Egypt, the withdrawal of support essentially from Egypt for Hamas. The closing of the tunnels, I think, has been a major factor in terms of cutting off the economy in Gaza and putting pressure on Hamas, both in terms of its ability to pay salaries to function, as well as getting pressure from the public in terms of their increasingly difficult situation because of the tunnel closures. And I think that on the PA or Fatah side, you see that there is perhaps less and less effective dependency on international sponsors, because they're not getting what they expect to get from going along with the program related to the peace process and international assistance. So they're also more willing to look at reconciliation more seriously, feeling also pressure from their own side in the West Bank and amongst their constituents. And what is interesting, of course, is that people have pointed out that this is an organic agreement that came out of Gaza. It wasn't agreed in Doha, although it's based on an agreement that was made previously in Doha. This happened between Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza. The Palestinian private sector was represented when they signed the agreement. Fatah officials were there, and Hamas from inside Gaza was there at the signing. And so that indicates that there is genuine support for this reconciliation, that it's broad, and most likely that they've been getting signals from outside that this will be supported by the U.S. and Europeans. So I think that there was sort of a perfect storm, and the people seized this opportunity.
How do you think this reconciliation agreement plays into Mahmoud Abbas's overall strategy? What is he trying to achieve in the next, let's say, year, 18 months, 2 years?
Well, I think that it's a big question. I think that the PA has been proceeding quite a long time without a real strategy, and I think it's unlikely that they have one now. I think that they are toying with the idea of utilizing the international plane to see what they can leverage from that. Abbas has signed up to international treaties, declared a Palestinian state, essentially, and so there is a flirtation going on with the idea of moving away from the bilateral negotiation track to a multilateral process of engaging with the UN, and I think that it's a legitimate move, and I think it's one that perhaps Abbas himself is not totally convinced of, because he is a man of negotiations. But I think that if the Israelis continue to, Netanyahu and cabinet and the constituency that is leading Israel continues to pressure the Palestinians in the way that it is, it's possible that Abbas will be pushed closer to the UN front. Now, what can achieve from that is a big question. Unity, I think, is perhaps part of it, but my guess is that if this is allowed to succeed, if it moves forward, it will take on a life of its own, perhaps. And from that, we may see strands of strategy or tactical maneuvering at least emerging, but I think it would not be correct to say that there's a full-fledged strategy in place.
Do you think he's still fixated on a two-state solution, or is there another aim in mind?
I think Abbas is very much committed to the idea of partition. He is of that generation that made the hard choice to accept a territorial compromise of 22% of mandate Palestine, and that is, I don't know if you're around him a lot, that is sort of his mantra. And so he himself is very committed to that and wants to see it happen. There's Palestinians, I think, still are very invested in the idea of or normative possibility of self-determination. But I think people are increasingly skeptical, and we've seen the rise of the discourse of the one-state solution. And I think Abbas's response of going to the UN is in part a response to those rising voices that are saying we want our rights rather than just to keep, organizing ourselves around something that is never going to happen.
In the fallout from the collapse of the talks, we've heard Martin Indyk give a number of briefings, notably one to the Washington Institute of Near East Policy in this building, actually, in which he talked about Abbas basically being intent now on retiring and finding a successor. So what is your analysis on are there potential successors? Will this be a battle? Is there one or two that are the leading contenders, and which direction might they take the Palestinian movement?
Well, I think not unlike the other Arab countries, there's not a thing of party politics in the Palestinian territories. There was an attempt to set up a third way party. Salam Fayyad was part of that, Mustafa Barghouti, and it didn't take off. And there have not been elections since 2005. So there's no national elections. So there's no vibrant, healthy political scene. So we can't say that there's an alternative, clear alternative, popular alternative to Abbas, to Fatah. I think largely people are looking at what is the situation, what can be gained from continuing along the track that Abbas has been pursuing, and I think that that's the primary sort of variable that people are thinking about when they think politically. They're not necessarily thinking about individuals because there's no clear party, other alternative party to Hamas and Fatah, which are both suffering, and there's no clear individual leader. So really, in some ways, it's you may say that Fatah would end up inevitably being sort of the lead contender in any election scenario because they're the ones that can maintain the status quo to the degree needed so that people continue to get salaries, etc. Or you could say that, in fact, if we had full open elections, that there would be an ability of different actors to come in and perhaps renew the Palestinian democracy in a way where you would see new leaders come out based on merit and vision. I think the former scenario is the more likely one, and that there may be some jockeying amongst Fatah to try to figure out who will be the next successor to lead the status quo forward.
In the Israeli response from the government has been rhetorically very harsh. Actually, I don't think have done anything very concrete up till now, but their big card that they have is the threat to withhold the tax receipts that they collect on behalf of the Palestinians, which would mean that the Palestinians could not meet payroll for the, I believe it's 160,000 public employees on the West Bank, and I think another 40,000 in Gaza. And then there's been talk that if that were to happen, the Palestinians, one option for the Palestinians would be basically to dismantle the PA and hand the keys back to Israel. So my question is, how likely do you think it is that either of those moves might take place, that the Israelis will actually withhold the tax receipts and keep withholding them for month after month, and in response the Palestinians dismantle the PA?
Well, before I answer that, let's just say that we have seen impact of the Israeli response to this new government, and that is in denying the ministers the freedom to move between the West Bank and Gaza, so that the Gaza ministers were not able to attend the inauguration ceremony, and then they held their first meeting, I think, today, and they were not able to convene as a collective. They had to convene by video from linking Gaza and the West Bank, and I think that hurts. That's not a minor thing for Israel to do, and I think they've been threatening generally to withhold the VIP status, which means that people can move. A certain class of elites can move more easily around these checkpoints, which are a huge drain on Palestinian spirit and resources and time and money. And I just don't discount that as being very significant in terms of form of pressure on this new government, on Fatah, on Abbas, etc. So we're already seeing the consequences of that threat, or the manifestation of that threat. Now, in terms of will the Israelis withhold taxes, and will the PA decide to dissolve? I think that this is, on the Palestinian side, there's an ongoing debate about the usefulness of the PA.
Sorry, yeah, we're going to take questions that are coming in over the internet in a minute. So while you're answering that, I'm going to take a look at these questions. So
sure.
Please.
So I think
lack of attention on my...
No, it's fine. So I think that there is an ongoing debate amongst Palestinians on whether to maintain the PA, given that it's an interim authority. It's time of seeing through permanent status agreement is long past. I think majority of people come up with, well, we'd rather not suffer the consequences of having the aid money and the institutions that have been established pursuant to the PA's existence go away. So there is an interest in maintaining it just for basic comfort and levels. But there's a challenge in how to make the PA representative of the interests and needs of the Palestinians and less about serving an external agenda.
Let me ask you something which is of great consequence to us here at J Street. The Kerry Initiative seems to have broken down fairly irrevocably. And in his speech at West Point last week on foreign policy, the president didn't even mention this issue at all. So the question is, under what circumstances could there be a diplomatic re-engagement? Does it require a new Israeli coalition? Does it require a new Palestinian leadership, or both? Does it require a new U.S. administration? Are we in for a very lengthy suspension, or is there a way of re-engaging in the not too distant future?
Well, my answer to that question is I hope that we don't reinitiate peace talks without figuring out why they haven't worked for 2 decades. So that's really my bottom line, is that I don't think we should be thinking now about, well, how do we get the parties back to the table to talk about formulas on security, borders, etc. I think we need to think about how to restructure the process so that it is more effective. We need to think about the conditions that can produce a fruitful, fair agreement, fair and just agreement. I think this is an opportunity. The breakdown of the talks is an opportunity for us to do some thinking, and also we see a lot of movement in terms of the thinking of people on the ground, on both the Israeli and the Palestinian parts. And I think that we need to enable that rethinking to happen. And I think the U.S. should continue to press for a settlement freeze and various conditions that make a peace process possible and successful. But instead of thinking about how to go back to the table, we should think about what does that table and that context look like.
Interesting, thank you. A couple of these questions actually are related, so let me just ask them. These are questions that have come to us over YouTube. How can the US ensure its aid is not funding Hamas? And the second question is, where is Islamic Jihad now, since Israel will hold the PA accountable now for rockets, to the extent that they will come from Gaza, it seems that they could play spoiler.
So no money, US money, goes to Hamas. That's an impossibility because of the designation of Hamas as a terrorist group. And if you look at the cabinet lineup, there are no Hamas individuals, representatives in the government. So whatever aid goes to the Palestinians for security assistance or to support the PA is not going to Hamas. So I think that's a question that's not necessarily in the realm of what's realistic, and there's no way that Congress would let that happen. And I think that there will be a very vigilant approach to looking at what happens in Palestine, the Palestinian territories, around this new government, with this new government. What are the policies that are being made? And I think, depending on the elections, if they happen, and I think that's a big if, and what, who's elected, I think then we can perhaps revisit the question. But I think that maybe there's also a necessity to revisit the issue of how we approach Hamas, because to the second question, they have not been engaging in the kind of regular violence that the second question is suggesting. I mean, they have withheld rocket fire, and they have agreed to ceasefires with Israel, etc. So, and they have signaled their willingness to sign up to principles that are very compromising around the two-state paradigm. So I think that we have to think about what is the most effective policy to seek progress on the Palestinian front, and to continue to box Hamas and its supporters into a corner based on a fear of violence, I think is perhaps counterproductive, and we need to question a lot of our assumptions as part of our rethink and our reset.
Do you see this agreement as part of the slow morphing or changing of Hamas into a purely political movement, a movement that would contest elections, and if it lost them, form a political opposition?
Well, I think that that's one of the potential outcomes of them coming into the fold with this government, is that they will be, they're signing up essentially to the status quo, and so that will force their hand more and more in terms of participating in a conditioned political process.
Which other players have influence in Gaza? One reads obviously Iran backs some of the other militant groups that are there, Islamic Jihad and others. One reads about links between militias in Gaza and groups in the Sinai, which obviously the Egyptians are very concerned about. So who else has influence on what goes on in Gaza, and how might they use that influence?
Well, I think that that's a very important question, because everything these days is regionally determined. And so I think we have to look at the situation in Palestine and Israel in a regional context. In terms of what Hamas's future calculations will be and who will be playing their strings, I think Iran is probably less invested in. Everyone is less invested in really in seeing a very active Hamas come out against the consensus, because Iran is negotiating currently with the U.S. It's not going to take a risk in upsetting it. I think that Egypt is very clearly in the Gulfi camp of the Emiratis and Saudi Arabia. And they are not interested in seeing the Brotherhood, obviously. So I don't think we will see a lot of interference that is favoring a strong Hamas in the immediate to medium term.
Mm-hmm.
And quite the opposite. We could see that Europe and the U.S. could potentially play a force with respect to Hamas's calculations, especially if they see benefits from signing up to this agreement. If the blockade is eased, or if assistance is enabled to go into Gaza to rehabilitate Gaza institutions, if the energy issues in Gaza are able to be addressed, then Hamas may see it. They may be influenced by those that have previously chose to disassociate with it.
As you might know, we at J Street have a major event coming up this weekend on the West Coast, a leadership summit that's going to bring 600 or 700 of our supporters and activists and a number of interesting speakers together in San Francisco. And it is, in fact, the largest event we've ever had on the West Coast. One of the featured speakers is Salam Fayyad, the former Palestinian Prime Minister, who, when he was in office, was something of a darling of the West, and had a policy of trying to build the institutions of the state so that it would kind of be ready to spring into existence at the appropriate moment. So my question is that approach still being pursued? Has it been discredited? What is actually going on in terms of building state institutions, especially in the West Bank?
Well, I think that the political project of let's build Palestinian institutions, state institutions, and then the international, the Western governments will hand us our state, has failed as a project. I think that's clear, and it failed not just because Salam left the position of prime minister, but because it just didn't convince anyone. And Israel continues to be the primary determinant here. So I think that that political discourse has sort of gone, but the Palestinians continue to try to strengthen their institutions, and this technocratic government is quite interesting if you look at the bios. There's heavy investment in trying to make it work on the part of people that are around Abu Mazen, and many of the technocrats that are around him, and many of whom are now represented in the government, such as Mohammed Mustafa, the deputy prime minister. and there are others. And so I think that the project of state building as a functional one is ongoing. But now the discourse is much more about how can we serve Palestinian interests as opposed to build our state institutions in order to gain world acceptance and statehood.
Okay. We're almost out of time, and so maybe there's time for one more question. And I want to follow up on that. When we talked about Israel withholding tax receipts or possibly doing that, how fragile is the Palestinian economy? It seems to me that we're in a fragile situation all around. As you know, last Friday, I believe, the Israelis caught an individual wearing a suicide vest at one of the checkpoints. And it seems to me that we're only one violent incident away from a potential meltdown or spillover. So you've laid out a situation over the course of this talk in which basically business as usual, in a sense, this government tries to function. The Israelis make life a little bit difficult for them, but their life on the ground goes on, maybe incrementally improving, maybe not. How likely is it that that this can all be destroyed in an instant by rash moves on the part of either side, or by something that we can't really foresee coming out of left field, like an act of violence?
Well, whether there's an act of violence or not, the PA is very fragile. It has millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in deficit. It's dependent on foreign aid, and the EU is responsible for paying PA salaries. It's not an independent entity. It's dependent on Israel to hand over the VAT, which is an important source of revenue, and so it's not economically healthy, and it's always fragile, and it's possible to cut it off at any moment. So I laid out, if you're suggesting I laid out a scenario that the status quo continues, that's one scenario. I think that another is that it doesn't work. If this unity deal is serious, I think Israel finds it very threatening to see Palestinian unity because it's a sign of strength and consensus. And so I've seen a lot of commentary that the Israelis see it in their strategic interest to continue with the status quo, to continue transferring the VAT, to continue allowing the PA to function. But I really, I do assume that there's a lot of also rethinking going on within Israel about the possibility of unilateral moves, which could possibly include trying to annex part of the West Bank. I think it makes it hard now for Israel to do that because you have a strong technocratic unity government that has been supported by the West, nominally supported, initially with public statements. So it makes it hard for Israel to take these unilateral moves, but no doubt the Israelis are reconsidering the status quo themselves, and the Israelis have the potential to change the status quo scenario on the ground.
Leila, I want to thank you for spending this time with us. I think it's been really helpful and interesting. I want to remind anyone that's watching that you can follow our National Summit, which begins on Saturday evening. It will be live streamed on our website, which is jstreet.org. And as things move forward, we'll maybe have the opportunity to do this again. So thank you very much.
Thank you.